I have entitled this About the Foundations of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, because it's not the whole story by any means. In April 1970, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism recommended, I quote, university studies in the humanities and the social sciences related to languages other than English and French, end of quote. The other 15 recommendations, many again in education, practically begged for implementation once a federal policy of multiculturalism was enacted. The Commission was the federal government's response to Quebec's quiet revolution, which had insisted that the Quebecois were not a people like the others, faced as they were with the steady erosion of their language and culture. This really aroused the organized Ukrainian Canadian Community, which declared that we too were not a people like the others, being readily assimilated in Canada and deliberately Russified in the hermetically sealed Soviet Union. In the spring of 1970, the Ukrainian Canadian Students' Union, CIUS, obtained a federal grant for several field workers to press the ethnic communities to agitate for a federal policy of multiculturalism. One of the field workers somehow found me, and I was gently persuaded to participate in a multicultural conference at the University of Alberta in August 1970, followed immediately by another conference, a CIUS conference at St. Andrew's College, University of Manitoba. Under its then president, Bogdan Kravchenko, CIUS was a dynamic organization, politically sophisticated, with media smarts, and quite brazen in tight situations. Most students were second-generation youth from the post-war Ukrainian immigration, some quite interested in Ukrainian studies. To match their enthusiasm, I contacted the Ukrainian professional and business clubs, a more effective political pressure group, I thought, to push for a policy of multiculturalism than the largely emigre-led Ukrainian Canadian Committee of that time. The P&B membership was largely Canadian-born. Almost a few were politically active, and a good number were even rich. In Edmonton, almost immediately, I became an ex officio member of the club's executive and attended its and members' monthly meetings for the next 10 years. In the process, the Ukrainian Canadian Professional and Business Federation was revived, and I even became its president for 2 years, 1973 to 1975. In October 1971, the pressure, mainly by Ukrainians, paid off when the federal government introduced its policy of multiculturalism within a bilingual English-French framework, and provincial governments followed suit, especially on the prairies and in Ontario. It was quickly evident that neither the P&B clubs nor their federation had any specific cultural or ideological identity. So in 1973, our federation executive in Edmonton decided to tie the professional and business sector to education. We would build, we said, a national educational ladder out of the Ukrainian kindergartens already underway in Edmonton's public and separate schools, followed by the anticipated English-Ukrainian bilingual classes at the elementary school level, and the Ukrainian classes already in place at the secondary level. The latter to be capped by a Research and Publications Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the university. The entire latter, hopefully, to be fully funded by government. No small ambitions, you see. And with Peter Savarin's political help, in July 1976, the provincially funded institute came into being. Peter, who was part of our Federation executive, had been a member of the university's Board of Governors since 1972. He was prominent in the community and in the Progressive Conservative Party, then in power, earning brownie points and political IOUs that eventually catapulted him into the chancellorship of the University of Alberta Senate. His phone calls were returned by the powerful, and he was a very good man to know. Far more important for our purposes than CIUS's earlier relationships within the university or with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute or the Soviet Ukraine is the future of Ukrainian studies in Canada. One could note, however, that with the initial open hostility of the deans of the Faculty of Arts and of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research, the fact that the university president, Harry Gunning, and the two chairs of the all-important Academic Development Committee, Henry Kreisel and his successor, Meyer Horowitz, all favored the Federation's proposal for an institute, endured its viability when it counted most. Ensured its viability when it counted most. Now, in drawing up the proposal, I saw CIUS and the bilingual classes as the first step in the institutionalizing multiculturalism, similar to the institutionalized French-English bilingualism then being created by the federal government. As I put it in my memoirs on CIUS's first decade, to me, multiculturalism meant broadening the ethnic base of Canada's mainstream institutions. And at least in public education, the implication was quite clear. The English-Ukrainian bilingual classes begun in September 1974 and the Institute were both visible public manifestations of the Ukrainian fact in Canada. Now, if the other ethnic groups did not wish to accompany the French Canadians into the country's public institutions, that was their affair. For me, the larger the Ukrainian presence became, the better. For that ensured the kind of professional or quality institutions and results that alone could impress and engage the Canadian born of Ukrainian ancestry. The latter had to acquire an objective understanding of their circumstances in Canada in the interest of both an enlightened multiculturalism and an appreciation of Ukraine's unfortunate fate as a politically submerged nation. End of quote. In the new multiculturalism, the song and dance, the colorful costumes, and the ethnic cuisine of the past, the cultural pluralism hitherto favored by most Canadians, was not enough. What was needed was the lifting of the Ukrainian cultural agenda into the state's schools and the state's universities, to mention no other public institutions, and there were others. Unfortunately, however, once the bilingual classes, the Institute, and other Ukrainian study centers, the chair at the University of Alberta, Toronto, and similar positions elsewhere, once they came into being, the Ukrainian community appeared to fall asleep. The sheer success seemingly made further activism unnecessary. Yet in the 1990s and in subsequent years, much quickly changed, with all new developments but one affecting the Ukrainian community negatively. The one positive event was, of course, the collapse of the dreadful Soviet Union, and the birth of a free and independent Ukraine. Among the negatives, however, was first, the rise of the ethnically hostile new neoconservative political movement, most evident in Preston Manning's Reform Party, whose sustained attacks on state funding of multiculturalism led to the demise of official multicultural policies and programs. Second, immigration from the Third World moved the social and political needle from a concern with ethnic diversity to how best to accommodate the new racial and religious diversity. Third, the Ukrainian Canadian Professional and Business Federation and such formerly large clubs as that in Edmonton collapsed. Fourth, the English-Ukrainian bilingual classes in Edmonton's public schools simply disappeared. Fifth, few of the retired or about to retire professors in Ukrainian studies were likely to be replaced. Sixth, university courses were limping or disappearing altogether because of a lack of apparent interest and low enrollments. Now, what role did the academics in Ukrainian studies play in all this? Well, certainly the situation in Ukraine received a lot of attention. But as already indicated, for the Academy the task was double-barreled. It was not just to convey a better public appreciation of Ukraine's many difficulties in the enormous task of building a state almost from scratch. It was also to convey an objective understanding of the changing circumstances of Ukrainian group life in Canada. But regarding the latter, the academics were nowhere to be seen. They said nothing publicly about the disastrous impact on institutionalized multiculturalism of the terrible neoconservative movement. Nor did they say anything about the state's movement away from ethnic studies to the new racial and religious challenges. Nor did they comment on the collapse of the bilingual classes, on the collapse of the P&B Federation, or the important future viability of P&B clubs, or the disappearance of the bilingual classes in Edmonton's public schools, or the looming crisis in retaining the hard-won academic gains of the past. Now, I know, of course, that academics generally like to be left alone to pursue their specialties, and Ukrainian academics are no different. But just as Ukrainians had earlier insisted that they were not a people like the others, it is also true that as a group, academics in Ukrainian studies are not practitioners like the others. Theirs is a very special constituency because their specialties are on the margin of mainstream university studies, especially in arts, in these faculties. The latter themselves, the arts faculties, for at least a decade now, almost outcasts in the economic and political preoccupation with STEM courses, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. At the base of the special constituency for academics in Ukrainian studies is, of course, the Ukrainian community. And for many years now, it has not been cultivated much by the academics, either through membership in its organizations or by giving its problems much attention. There are many very able and intelligent professional and business people of Ukrainian background out there who are simply not being reached. Academics in professional Ukrainian studies have not mixed with them, informed them, or advised them, or occasionally even led them when necessary. And to do that well is, of course, as important. It is as important to be familiar with their cultural and political history and that of Canadians generally, as it is to understand the usual nuanced maze of mainstream academic culture on Canadian campuses. So how really did we end up with so little apparent interest in Ukrainian studies? At this at a time when there is more endowment money for such studies than ever before. What share of the blame must the academic leadership bear? I would insist, concluding, that the gap between the town and the gown is largely responsible for the bitter fruit that has brought this very conference into being. And one is left wondering whether it is now even too late to try to close that gap. Thank you.